Hi, everybody. It's Sunday night at 10:40, and I miss you all so much. And I want you all to know about the Vietnam War, and so I'm making this special screencast for you. Unfortunately, the Vietnam War was really long, so my screencast might be kind of long. Don't feel like you have to listen to it all at once. But there's going to be some CASA learning questions posted for you to do after you listen to all of this. So, Vietnam. After World War II, the Geneva Accords kept Vietnam as a French colony. And the Vietnamese began fighting for their independence from the French, and that is where American involvement in Vietnam began, when we helped the French try to hold on to their colony of Vietnam. The Geneva Accords were a big meeting held in Switzerland in 1953, settling a lot of different problems that came at the end of World War II. Eventually, Vietnam did receive its independence, and they were divided very similarly to Korea, at a natural latitude line on the Earth. Korea is divided at the 38th parallel. Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel. But similar to Korea, the North was communist and the South was not. So in North Vietnam, you had their leader, their communist leader, Ho Chi Minh. His picture's on the bottom left there. And he had obviously followers in North Vietnam that were communist. Those were the Viet Minh, named after him, Ho Chi Minh. All right, so Viet Minh, communists in North Vietnam, but he also had communist supporters in South Vietnam. Even though South Vietnam was not communist, there were people who wanted it to be and who supported Ho Chi Minh, and they were called the Viet Cong. And they were going to be the biggest problems for American soldiers when we eventually do go to fight in Vietnam. In South Vietnam, which was not communist, they had their own leader. His name is pronounced Ngo Dinh Diem. And he was not a communist, but he was not a good man. All right. He was not democratic. In fact, he persecuted a lot of Buddhists in South Vietnam. So by no means was he a good guy, but the United States supported him because he was not communist. And that's one of the most important things that you need to understand about why the United States became involved in Vietnam, and that is to stop the spread of communism. So if Diem was not communist, doesn't matter how bad he is otherwise, as long as he's not communist, the United States supported him. Okay, so one of the ways that the Viet Cong in South Vietnam got their support from the North was on a secret trail called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, again named after the northern leader Ho Chi Minh. And this trail started up in North Vietnam, but actually left the country altogether, went through some neighboring countries of Vietnam, mainly Laos and Cambodia, and then re-entered South Vietnam at several different points, bringing supplies to the Viet Cong in the South. So, a big target for the United States, if we want to defeat the Viet Cong in the South, is to cut off their supply line along this trail. Okay. The first president who really had to deal with Vietnam was President Kennedy. And the reason he said that we should get involved there is because of the domino theory. And this is a big vocab word related to Vietnam, the domino theory. What happens when you hit one domino, the rest fall. And so the fear was that if Vietnam fell to communism, that the rest of Southeast Asia would also fall to communism. And so we had to stop it in Vietnam before the rest of the countries fell. Right? If one Asian country falls to communism, the rest will too. And I really like this cartoon, how the American soldier, right, is trying to hold up all the dominoes to stop them from falling to communism. And the Viet Cong, right, this kind of a symbol of communism in South Vietnam, is trying to push them all over. Okay, so the South Vietnamese people themselves were really not happy with their own leader. And so the United States secretly supported a military coup d'etat or swift overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam. And he ended up being assassinated by his own military leaders with the support of the United States. So that is a picture of him on the left, Diem himself, after he was assassinated. And on the right is a picture of a Buddhist monk who has set fire to himself in protest to show that he would rather burn himself alive than allow himself to be persecuted by Diem and his government for being Buddhist. So a lot of unrest in South Vietnam. Ironically, and sadly, only a few weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated himself, and that's going to leave his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, to deal with the problems in Vietnam. So, in 1964, the United States had some patrol ships off the coast of North and South Vietnam to kind of monitor the situation. A report was sent to President Johnson after he took office that one of our ships was fired at by a North Vietnamese ship. And so Johnson asked Congress to allow him as commander-in-chief to send more troops to Vietnam. And that permission slip, I like to call it, that Congress gave to President Johnson to basically do whatever he wanted in Vietnam is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin is the body of water just off the coast of North Vietnam where our military ships claimed that they were shot at. Turns out, I'm not sure exactly how much later, but it turned out that the American ship was never really fired at by the North Vietnamese. And so yet again, we have another war that America became involved in with sort of a shady start, a shady story. Okay, so Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave President Johnson permission to do whatever he wants in Vietnam. So our soldiers are sent to North and South Vietnam, again, trying to stop the spread of communism to South Vietnam. It was really hard fighting over there. We did not know the land. It was a really thick jungle, hot, humid, rainy climate. Very hot. I think I said that already. And we didn't know the land, but our enemies did. And so the Viet Cong used booby traps and landmines in these jungles to trap our soldiers. There was really no front line, no battlefield drawn because these Viet Cong were not an official army. They did not have uniforms. They didn't have a shirt that said, "Hey, Viet Cong, I'm your enemy." They wore regular civilian clothing. They lived in the villages with civilians, and it was really hard for us to tell who was our friend and who was not. Okay, so if we can't identify our enemy, we have to be able to scare them out, to kind of show themselves. So one of the ways that we did that was, three of the ways that we did that was to use napalm, which was a new form of gasoline that we could spray or drop over the jungle. And it basically set this chain reaction of explosions across the jungle to burn them out. Agent Orange was a pesticide, again, sprayed on the jungle from above with helicopters. And little did we know at the time that this Agent Orange was actually cancer causing. And so we ended up causing a lot of our own veterans and Vietnamese civilians to get cancer from exposure to this pesticide known as Agent Orange. And finally, we have search and destroy missions. Our soldiers would go into the villages of innocent Vietnamese people and basically kill them or threaten them unless they gave up the Viet Cong that were staying there. So there's a picture of napalm. Agent Orange at the bottom is a man who got skin cancer because of his exposure to Agent Orange. And on the bottom right is a Vietnamese girl who was born with birth defects because her mother was exposed to Agent Orange. So bad stuff. Okay. From the beginning of United States involvement in Vietnam, the truth had been kept from the American people. So several presidents, starting with Kennedy, were involved in, or responsible for U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And right from the beginning, they were not truthful with the American people. Diem, when he was assassinated, the American people did not know that the United States military had given support to Diem's military to overthrow and kill him. Under President Johnson, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed by Congress after the false report. I mentioned that earlier, that a North Vietnamese ship had fired on our ships, and that's really what really got us involved in the first place, was that Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. When Johnson did send troops officially, with the permission of Congress, to Vietnam, Congress was unaware that as Commander-in-Chief, Johnson had already been ordering these bombings of North Vietnam without telling Congress or the American people. And as we continue through the war, people can see what's going on TV. The Vietnam War was the first television war, because no war before the 1960s had taken place at the same time as most people had a television in their living room. And so Johnson would get on TV nightly and say, oh, we're winning, we're achieving our goal, we're going to stop the Viet Cong, we're going to beat communism. Yet at the same time, the American people were getting reports of the thousands of American deaths that were happening in the war. They're seeing images of dead American soldiers' bodies being taken off of airplanes, coming home to the United States. And so what they were seeing was going on in Vietnam is not what President Johnson said was happening. Okay, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. President Johnson giving an update on the war, saying we're so close to winning, yet all of these coffins with American veterans are coming home. Okay, another thing that led to this mistrust in President Johnson, or distrust in President Johnson, was the Tet Offensive. This is in 1968. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year holiday. And just like in the United States, people take time off, they have parties to celebrate the New Year. This was a time to do that at the end of January in 1968 for the holiday of Tet. And so officially, the North and South Vietnamese governments had signed a ceasefire, an agreement that they would stop fighting for several days over the Tet holiday. However, the Viet Cong are not an official player, right? They don't have a government. Technically, they're under the South Vietnamese government. And they had not signed this ceasefire. And so while American soldiers were sort of relaxing and not on guard, the Viet Cong launched attacks on our soldiers throughout South Vietnamese cities and American military bases. And we killed far more of them than they killed of us. But again, when this is reported on the American news, it shows, again, that we are not close to winning the war if the Viet Cong were able to surprise us so well. All right, it showed we were not winning the war as LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, okay, just like JFK, John F. Kennedy. So these are just some images of the Tet Offensive, they call it. Those are the Viet Cong attacks on American soldiers. All right. Another reason the Vietnam War was very controversial back here in the United States was because of the draft. And people were being drafted into the war right at age 18. A lot of young guys right out of high school who didn't want to go and fight in the war, but were given a draft number, or eventually they started picking guys by birthday. You know, if your birthday is December 5th, then you're going to Vietnam in 3 months. Okay. And a lot of the men drafted were drafted because they were not in college. That was one of the rules, of the ways that you could get out of the draft, is if you were going to college. And in the 1960s, there was no federal financial aid. If you went to college, it was because your family was wealthy enough to pay for you to go. And so the draft was really controversial because it made poor white men and African American men the ones being drafted and having to go and fight and risk their lives and die for our country, while the wealthy men got out of it. So people who supported the war or the draft were called hawks. If you think about a hawk being, you know, an aggressive bird, Americans who supported the war were called hawks, and Americans who opposed the war became known as doves, right? A dove is a sign of peace. So a lot of college students really participating in huge demonstrations and protests against the war. Okay. I'm not really sure why I have another slide on the Tet Offensive, but these are some details about it. Like I said, it occurred on Vietnam's New Year, 1968. The Viet Cong hid weapons in trucks and coffins. Remember, they're not like an official army. They launched attacks on 100 towns. Eventually, the U.S. military did regain control of their cities and bases in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong lost a total of 32,000 soldiers. We only lost 3,000. But again, it was the fact that how are they able to get away with these surprise attacks if we were almost done winning? So because of all of this miscommunication between Lyndon B. Johnson and the American people over the news, he's telling us we're winning, but we really weren't. And all of this stress on Johnson over the war made him decide he did not want to run to be reelected in 1968. And so we will get a new president, Richard Nixon, who won because he promised the American people that he would end the war in Vietnam, that he would turn it over to the South Vietnamese people to fight their own war, right? So he's going to Vietnamize the war. We had Americanized the war by shoving our nose in their business. And now now Nixon wants to turn the war back over to the Vietnamese. And so this is what the American people voted for him to do. However, we have yet another president who is not honest about what he is doing in terms of our soldiers and dealing with communism in Vietnam. So we're supposed to be Vietnamizing, right? Our troops are supposed to be coming home, and some of them were coming home. But at the same time, again on the news is a report about a massacre. It's known as the My Lai massacre. My Lai is the name of the village where our troops on a search and destroy mission went into a South Vietnamese village and killed 200 innocent South Vietnamese villagers, women, children, whoever was in there, because they claimed they were shooting anyone who was helping the Viet Cong. Now, if you did the assignments on World War II, there was an example of this before, right? When the Nazis were put on trial after World War II to be held responsible for the Holocaust. And what you were supposed to remember about that at the Nuremberg trials is that you can't get away with crimes against humanity or crimes against civilians because you were following orders. And so the man who gave these orders, the lieutenant in charge of the troops who went in and killed these 200 South Vietnamese people was given a military trial and sent to prison and held responsible for his actions. Okay. Again, just a quick summary of the massacre. I mean, this is just disgraceful. You know, the dead bodies of the villagers on the road, this poor woman with a gun to her head. So really embarrassing for American soldiers. They were given a lot of heat for this when they returned home. But again, on their side, they had been drafted. This was not a war that they really chose to get involved in. So there's kind of like two sides of the coin here, I guess you would say. So what to do about all of this dishonesty as we go president after president not telling the American people what was really going on in Vietnam? Well, someone who worked in the Pentagon is the military headquarters for the United States. It's located just across the river from Washington, D.C. in Virginia. And someone who worked there snuck out a file containing all of the presidential decisions that had ever been made in regards to the war in Vietnam. And he gave these papers in this file to the New York Times. And the New York Times, day after day, started publishing more and more of this information. And so Nixon was president at the time, and he had his own secrets that he didn't want released in the newspaper. And so he ordered the New York Times to stop publishing what became known as the Pentagon Papers under the claim that it would hurt national security. And we've seen this happen before, right? During World War II, when the Japanese were relocated because of national security. And so Nixon thought he would get away with this again. So the Supreme Court actually had to decide. This is the Supreme Court case, New York Times versus United States. The Supreme Court had to decide, does the president have an executive privilege as the president to tell a form of media that they cannot release information based on national security? And in this case, the Supreme Court said no, that the president does not have that executive privilege, that the New York Times did have the right to publish this information. And so the New York Times continued to publish the information, so did several other papers. And again, the result of this, right, is that the American people gain more suspicion of their government. What is going on that their government is not telling them and hasn't been telling them for years? So that is one of the effects of the Vietnam War when you're going through those castle learning questions, is that the American people did not trust their government. Okay, so the war ends officially in April of 1975. That's when our last troops finally came home. And we did turn the war over to the South Vietnamese. They were not able to hold off the North Vietnamese for long, and eventually the entire country of Vietnam became communist. Now, we had never technically declared war, right? Congress never declared war on North Vietnam or on the Viet Cong in the South. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, like I said, was that permission slip from Congress for Johnson to just do what he wanted. But, I mean, it was a war. And thousands of American soldiers died there. Our original goal, right, was to contain or stop the spread of communism to South Vietnam. We did not achieve that goal, and so we could say that the Vietnam War is the only war in our history that the United States has lost from a military standpoint. We did not achieve our goal. Okay, some more results from the war in Vietnam. It is the last war in which the U.S. government used the draft. It still exists. The government does request that men, when they turn 18 years of age, sign up for the draft, but it has not been used since the war. It's on an emergency or need basis only. And not more importantly, but also just as important, Congress passed what is called the War Powers Act. And this limits what the president can do in his role as commander-in-chief of our military, because after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Johnson took that as a way to do whatever he wanted without consulting Congress or even letting the American people know. So, the War Powers Act states that the president must tell Congress within 48 hours if he wants to send troops to a hostile area in the world without a declaration of war. You might remember one of the first days of school, I asked you guys if President Trump wanted to send troops to North Korea tomorrow, could he do that? And the answer is yes, he can. And Johnson was sending troops to Vietnam in this case, and Congress didn't even know about it. And so if the president is going to send troops, he can do that, but he must tell Congress that he has sent those troops within 48 hours or 2 days. Those troops can remain wherever they have been sent for up to, I think I might be cutting off the number of days there, up to 90 days. Okay, so 3 months the president has to use our troops in any area of the world that he wants for whatever purpose he wants. And once those 3 months is up, Congress has two options. They can either give the president permission to keep those troops there or tell the president that the troops have to come home. Or if the troops are going to remain there and they want to give permission, they can also give a formal declaration of war on that country. Okay. One last change that came after the Vietnam War is the 26th Amendment to our Constitution. This amendment changed the voting age from 21 to 18. A lot of those young people, college-age kids, were protesting the war because 18-year-old men were being drafted, dying for our country in Vietnam, and they didn't have the right to vote for the commander-in-chief that was sending them there. And so they lowered the voting age to 18. So now if you're going to be drafted at 18, you can vote at 18. Okay. The next slide goes on to the end of the Cold War, which I'm going to make a separate screencast for this to finish out the Cold War. So that's it for now. Make sure you take a look at those CASEL learning questions on the Vietnam War. I miss you guys. I'm sorry I'm not going to see you in class again. Keep working. You're all doing great. Most of you are doing like every single assignment, and I really appreciate it, and I miss you. Bye.